War is coming. It means sacrifice for everybody. I have to serve. It's my duty. And you have to go away." Of course, he'd have been expecting it. Two of his friends' families had already packed up and left when the evacuation rumors had begun. What he hadn't expected was the rest, the worst part. And the fox, well, it's time to send him back into the wild anyway. A coyote howled then, so nearby that it made Peter jump. A second one answered, and then a third. Peter sat up and slammed the window shut, but it was too late. The yips and howls and what they meant were in his head now. Peter had only 2 bad memories of his mother. He had lots of good ones, too, and he often took those out to comfort himself, although he worried that they might fade from his exposure. But the 2 bad ones he'd buried deep. He did everything in his power to keep them buried. Now the coyotes were baying in his head, unearthing one of them. When he'd found about 5, he'd come upon his mother, standing dismayed beside a bed of blood-red tulips. Half of them were standing at attention, and half of them splayed over the ground, their blossoms crumbling. "A rabbit got them. He must think the stems are delicious, the little devil." Peter had helped his father set a trap that night. "We won't hurt him, right?" "Fine, we'll just catch him, then drive him into the next town. Let him eat someone else's tulips." Peter had buried the traps himself with a carrot, and then begged his father to let him sleep in the garden and keep watch. His father had said no, but helped him set an alarm clock so he'd be the first to awaken, and when it went off, Peter had run to his mother's room to lead her outside by the hand to see the surprise. The trap lay on its side at the bottom of a freshly scraped crater at least 5 feet across. Inside was a baby rabbit, dead. There wasn't a single mark on its little body, but the cage was scratched and dented and ground all around, clawed to rubble. "Coyotes," his father said, joining them. "They must have scared it to death trying to get in, and none of us even woke up." Peter's mother had opened the trap and lifted out the lifeless form. She held it to her cheek. There were just tulips, only a few tulips. Peter found the carrot, one end nibbled off, and threw it as far away as he could. Then his mother had placed the rabbit's body in its cupped palm and gone to get a shovel. With a single finger, Peter had traced its ears, unfurling like ferns from its face, and its paws, miraculously tiny, and the soft fur of the neck, slick with his mother's tears. When she'd returned, his mother had touched his face, which burned with shame. "It's okay. You didn't know." But it wasn't okay. For a long time afterward, when Peter closed his eyes, he'd seen coyotes, their claws raking dirt, their jaws snapping. He saw himself where he shouldn't have been, keeping watch in the garden that night. Over and over he saw himself doing what he should have, rising from the sleeping bag, finding a rock and hurling it. He saw the coyotes fleeing back into the darkness, and he saw himself opening the trap and setting the rabbit free. And with that memory, the anxiety snake struck so hard that it stunned Peter's breath right out of him. He hadn't been where he should have been that night the coyotes killed the rabbit, and he wasn't where he should be now. He gasped to fill his lungs and sat bolt upright. He tore the photo in half and then in half again, and he pitched the pieces under his bed. Leaving PAX hadn't been the right thing to do. He jumped to his feet. He'd already lost a lot of time. He fished some cargoes, a long-sleeved camouflage t-shirt, a fleece sweatshirt from his suitcase, and an extra set of underwear and socks. He stuffed everything in a backpack, except the sweatshirt, which he tied around his waist. Jackknife in his jean pocket, wallet. He debated for a minute between the hiking boots and the sneakers and decided on the boots, although he didn't put them on. He looked around the room, hoping to find a flashlight or anything resembling camping equipment. The room had been his father's when he'd been a boy, but aside from a few books on the shelf, it was clear his grandfather had cleaned all the things out. The cookie tin had seemed to surprise him, an oversight. Peter bumped his fingers over the spines of the books. An atlas. He pulled it down, amazed at his luck, and flipped through it until he came to the map that showed the route he and his father had traveled. You'll only be 300 miles away, his father had tried to bridge the silence of the drive a couple of times. When I get a day off, I'll come. Peter had known that it would never happen. They didn't get days off in the war. Besides, it wasn't his father he was already missing. And then he saw something he hadn't realized. The highway snaked around a long range of foothills. If he cut straight across those, instead of following the highway, he could save a lot of time. Plus, reduce the risk of being caught. He started to rip out the page, then realized he couldn't leave his grandfather such an obvious clue. Instead, he studied the map for a long time, then replaced the atlas on the shelf. 300 miles. It looked like he would shave off 100 of them by taking the shortcut, so say around 200. If he would walk at least 30 miles a day, he could make it in a week, or less. They'd left PAX at the head of the access road that led to the ruins of the old rope mill. Peter had insisted on this road because hardly anyone ever used it. PAX didn't know about traffic, and he'd be there in the woods and fields all around him. He'd go back and find PAX there, waiting, in 7 days. He wouldn't let himself think about what might happen to a tame fox in those 7 days. No, PAX would be waiting at the side of the road right where they'd left him. He'd be hungry for sure and probably scared, but he'd be okay. Peter would take him home. They would stay there. Just let somebody try to make him leave this time. That was the right thing to do. He and PAX, inseparable. He glanced around the room again, resisting the urge to run. He couldn't afford to miss a thing. The bed. He pulled the blanket off, ruffled up the sheets, and punched the pillow until it looked like slept in. From his suitcase, he took out the picture of his mother he'd kept on his bureau, the one taken on her last birthday, holding up a kite Peter had made for her, and smiling as if she'd never had a better present in her life, and slid it into his backpack. Next, he pulled out the thing of hers that he'd kept hidden in his bottom drawer at home, her gardening gloves, still smudged with the last soil she'd ever lifted, a box of her favorite tea, which had long ago lost its peppermint scent, the thick candy-cane striped knee socks she wore in the winter. He touched them all, wishing he could take everything back home where it belonged, and then chose the smallest of the items, a gold bracelet with an enameled phoenix charm she'd worn every day, and tucked it in the middle of his backpack with the photo. Peter surveyed the room a last time, his eyes, his baseball glove, and then crossed to the bureau and stuffed them in his backpack. They didn't weigh much, and he didn't want them when he'd be back home. Besides, just felt better if he'd had them with him. Then he eased the door open and crept into the kitchen. He set the backpack on the oak table, and in the dim light from above the stove, he began to pack supplies: a box of raisins, a sleeve of crackers, and a half-empty jar of peanut butter. PAX would come out of any hiding spot for peanut butter. From the refrigerator, he took a bunch of string cheese sticks and 2 oranges. He filled the thermos with water, and then hunted through the drawers until he found matches, which he wrapped in tin foil. Under the sink, he scored 2 lucky finds, a roll of duct tape and a box of heavy-duty garbage bags. A tarp would have been better, but he took the 2 bags with gratitude and zipped the pack. Finally, he took a sheet of paper from the pad beside the phone and began a note. Dear Grandfather. Peter looked at the words for a minute, as if it were a foreign language, and then he crumpled up the paper and started a new note. I left early, wanted to get a good start on school, see you tonight. He stared at the page for a while, too, wondering if it sounded as guilty as he felt. At last he added, Thanks for everything, Peter. Placed the note on the salt shaker and slipped out. On the brick walk, he shrugged on his sweatshirt and crouched to lace his boots. He straightened up and shouldered his backpack. Then he took a moment to look around. The house behind him looked smaller than it had when he'd arrived, as if it were already receding into the past. Across the street, clouds scudded along the horizon, and a half-moon suddenly emerged, brightening the road ahead. End of chapter 2.